China is buying Canadian oil strategically, and somehow that's good news for both countries. This video is about trade without slogans, power without noise, and why China's shift away from the US might be the most significant economic development Canada did not quite plan for, but may need to respond to very quickly. As always, let me introduce this video very briefly. We're going to explore three things: the nature of China's global trade pivot, Canada's growing role as a quiet beneficiary, and how political tantrums shape and sometimes sabotage trillion-dollar supply chains. Before we get into today's story, here's something I think you'll genuinely want to check out. I just launched a book called Awake. It's a guide to thinking clearly in a world designed to confuse you. If you've ever felt like the headlines are manipulative or that politics is all noise and distraction, Awake will change the way that you see things. It gives you a framework for cutting through spin, spotting soft lies, and sharpening your decisions, whether you're looking at news, policy, or even your own instincts. It's only just launched, and for this week, there is a 10% early bird discount. You'll find the link in the description, and I'll also tag the launch video if you want to hear the full story behind it. Now, let's talk about what China is doing with Canada. When a superpower begins treating global trade like a custody battle, smaller countries get to sit and watch, and sometimes they actually win. In my view, that's exactly what's been playing out in recent months. Take the Donald Trump era US trade strategy. Tariffs were launched left, right, and center. From the vantage point of Washington, these were presumably tactical episodes in negotiation. But from the outside, it looked like somebody had torched the room to make a point. The message was loud: we're willing to blow up the whole system if you don't play by our rules, essentially. Meanwhile, the US national debt marched past $38 trillion as of October 2025, a record-breaking milestone, and more importantly, perhaps, it came after the fastest accumulation of $1 trillion outside the pandemic. In one 3-month stretch alone, the US added huge amounts of debt. So you'd think if you were the US, this kind of fiscal weight might push some restraint into your dealings, especially trade with big partners. But that doesn't seem to be happening. Instead, the US pressed tariffs on China, and China responded, but now with shouting headlines only. It threatened something far more strategic: export controls on critical minerals and rare earth elements. These are not soybeans or laptops. We're talking the raw inputs that every EV, every advanced semiconductor, every missile relies upon. Now, what this tells me is that China not only understands leverage, but is willing to use it privately, almost by default. While the US is tossing grenades, China is playing three-dimensional chess, basically. Here's the scenario. A country imposes tariffs, its rival counter tariffs. The first country acts shocked when the rival hints at cutting off critical supplies. The optics are very messy, but the underlying logic is clear. Control the supply chain inputs, and you control the bargaining table. And that's why, in my view, this moment matters. It's not just about the US versus China trade war, but about who sets the terms when the superpower starts losing its grip. Smaller players watch, some maneuver, some benefit. If this kind of framing helps you see more clearly, consider subscribing. I make videos for people who care about substance over spectacle. And if you're still with me, you're probably one of them. Now, in public, Donald Trump called it a fantastic deal, but in practice, what it looked like was a quiet surrender, in my view. Tariffs were cut by roughly 10%, still far higher than pre-Trump levels, but lower than his own threats. The US wanted minerals, China wanted the upper hand, and in my view, both sides knew who blinked first. Now, while Washington was still busy squabbling with allies and trying to make sense of its own mess, China was getting on with its own business. Here's what I found interesting. China's exports to the US dropped by about 27% during this trade standoff. And meanwhile, China managed to boost its exports to the EU by more than 14% and to Asian trading partners by almost 16%. And here's the surprise: they also started buying more oil from Canada than ever before. This is not just standard market logic. It feels more like a strategic redirection from their side as well. You can actually see it in major energy arteries. For example, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, TMX, running from Alberta, Canada to the Pacific Coast, that has shifted from being a pipeline destined to survive mainly the US West Coast into one increasingly serving Asia, especially China. China has become the top buyer of Canadian crude via TMX, displacing the US in that role. So what this tells me is, while the US is loudly beating its chest, China is actually changing the playing field. Canada, somewhat serendipitously, is being pulled into this new arrangement now. Now, let's not pretend that relations between Canada and China are warm. They're not. There have been political, cultural, and ideological irritants, massive ones, in fact. But here's what I noticed. Unlike the United States, Canada's approach is not performative. And I believe that makes it viable. Take Mark Carney, now Prime Minister. At the APEC summit just recently, Prime Minister Mark Carney reaffirmed his goal to double non-US exports over the next decade. When asked when China would match that ambition, the Chinese ambassador didn't just disagree, he floated something bolder. Why not triple? This is not a formal offer, of course, but it is a diplomatic nudge. If the goods are competitive and the terms are fair, China's door is wide open, and that to me isn't the language of fallback partnership, that's the language of strategy. To me, this says China doesn't see Canada merely as a fallback option. If Canada plays this right, they see it as a partner, and that's exactly the space Canada can work in. Of course, none of this is simple. I'm not saying that it is. The auto industry is heavily integrated across North America. If Canada opens its door to Chinese EVs, for example, it would rattle the US and likely provoke some retaliation, maybe even more tariffs. But that's precisely why I think the conversation must happen now and not after a crisis. If China is willing to build in Canada or to source battery inputs from Canadian mines, this opens more than just trades, but it opens influence, infrastructure, future bargaining power. And let's be clear, it's not about selling out to China. It's about recognizing that in a multipolar world, you don't have to pick sides. You just need to pick terms. You decide on how you engage and what you get back. Now, I know that there was a time when Canada's economic future was imagined as permanently fused to the US. One market, one direction, one reality. But those assumptions are now fading fast. And quite frankly, I'm scratching my head. Why is the US treating a still huge partner like a little neighbor you shake down rather than build with? Because the US strategy, as I see it, isn't just protectionist. In many cases, it's erratic. The messaging, we don't need your cars, we don't need your milk, is not just political theater. This is reshaping continental economics, and unless I'm misreading this, the US is falling behind a bit. To unpack that, on one hand, the US has ramped up tariffs dramatically. One study found that the real GDP impact of the 2025 tariff package alone could trim US GDP by about 0.9 percentage points this year and keep the economy permanently smaller by roughly about 0.6%. On the other hand, its debt is ballooning. For example, the total US federal debt recently in October just reached around 38 trillion. Its economic outlook is showing headwinds. Durable goods spending projections are weakening. Consumer spending growth is slowing. Some forecasts for 2025-2026 show consumer spending rising only 1 or 2%. If this was all part of a coherent story, like we protect our people, invest in our future, restructure intelligently, okay, I get it. But I don't see that. I see tariffs as a blunt instrument, fiscal wobbles, and messaging that alienates allies. And what is the payoff for the US? If you're attacking your trade relationships and inflating debt, you're not exactly helping yourself or your partners. Meanwhile, and here's the maddening part, while the US is caught up in its own drama, the rest of the world is quietly reorganizing. China is building new trade routes, new factories, new relationships, not just with Canada, but with the entire BRICS bloc and much of the global South. And the US is still stuck dealing with tariffs, media headlines about TikTok bans, and domestic labor supply shortages, which we've covered in another video. What I see here is a world quietly reshaping itself, and the loudest country in the room insists that it's still the center. It's like somebody throwing their weight around while the party has already moved down the corridor. Eventually, yes, all of this will be reversed in my view. Trade flows will adjust, supply chains will reroute, alliances will reform. Markets don't respond well to whimsy. So when the US inevitably pivots again, because in my view it will, countries like Canada will be left deciding whether they followed a tantrum or built something lasting. So here's the real question I want to leave you with. If Canada is being invited to expand trade with China, not out of ideology, but out of necessity, what kind of terms would you want to see in place? Because we're not just talking economics anymore, we're talking temperament. The US has treated diplomacy like theater. China, for all its opacity, has treated it like a long game, classic China. And Canada, caught in between, actually has a chance to do something rare in geopolitics, benefit from restraint. Not by shouting, not by picking sides, but by staying steady in a room full of tantrums. And maybe that's the lesson. In a world full of chest thumping, the quiet country wins the contract. If you're interested in sharpening how you think through these kinds of questions, not just what to believe, but how to reason, my book Awake is a good place to start. This week, there's a 10% off for viewers. You'll find the link below. And if this line of thinking resonates with you, I'd also recommend that you check out the other videos on my channel. There are many strong companions to this one, as a reminder that quiet influence can still shape loud outcomes. Thank you for watching. Until next time.